Tom Bennett was never one to ask for help. A rugged but gentle-hearted single father in his early 40s, he had learned long ago to shoulder pain quietly. After losing his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, Tom poured every ounce of love he had left into raising their daughter, Lily. He worked double shifts as an auto parts manager, packed school lunches with little notes tucked inside, and made sure every birthday felt like a celebration even when money was tight. But none of that prepared him for the night Lily was rushed to the hospital after collapsing at soccer practice. Alone in a sterile waiting room with fluorescent lights humming above him, Tom was drowning in a sea of fear and guilt. That's when a soft voice broke through the silence. An older woman named Margaret Lane, seated a few chairs away, offered him a tissue and a quiet presence that felt strangely comforting. She was a widow, too. Someone who had sat in that very hospital years ago, praying for a miracle she never got. What began as two strangers sharing a quiet night soon unfolded into something deeper, a connection, forged not in romance at first, but in shared grief, human kindness, and the fragile hope that healing can come from the most unexpected hands. Tom Bennett had sat in plenty of waiting rooms before dentist offices, school conferences, even the DMV, but never one that felt like this. The hospital's ER lobby was nearly empty, eerily quiet for a Thursday evening. But to Tom, it might as well have been a thunderstorm raging inside his chest. The antiseptic smell, the rhythmic beeping from distant monitors, the low murmur of nurses behind the discovery detail carved a deeper pit into his stomach. He couldn't remember the drive here, only the call from Lily's coach, the flash of lights on the ambulance, and the terrible stillness of her body when they lifted her in. 14 years old, the light of his life, and now lying unconscious somewhere behind those double doors. He clenched Lily's hoodie in his fists, the one she'd left in his truck, still faintly smelling of her lavender shampoo. His mind wouldn't stop circling the same questions. Why hadn't he noticed she wasn't feeling well? Was she pushing herself too hard? Should he have taken her in for a checkup last week, when she mentioned feeling dizzy? But she'd brushed it off, and he had believed her just like he believed that if he worked hard enough, held everything together tight enough, he could keep her safe. But life didn't work that way. He knew that better than anyone. He had once believed love was enough to keep his wife, Melanie, alive. They'd fought her cancer with every resource they could scrape together, from experimental treatments to herbal teas to prayer. But in the end, none of it had saved her. It was only Tom and Lily now, and losing his daughter too was a thought too painful to hold. A nurse passed by, giving him a practiced, gentle smile. He tried to read something in her eyes, anything that hinted at news, good or bad, but she just walked on. The silence was unbearable. He wanted someone to scream, to cry, to storm into the lobby shouting that Lily was okay. Instead, he was alone with the sound of the clock ticking too slowly and the pressure of unspoken fears pressing down like bricks on his chest. He let his head fall into his hands. His shoulders shook, not with sobs, but with the tension of a man who had held too much for too long. He had no one to call, no siblings, no parents left. Friends had drifted since Melanie passed. Everyone had their own lives. He didn't blame them. But now, with his child lying somewhere between the known and the unthinkable, Tom had never felt more utterly alone in the world. Time lost meaning in that sterile waiting room. The minutes melted into each other until Tom couldn't tell how long he'd been sitting there, hands folded tight, staring into nothing. He remembered dropping Lily off at practice that afternoon, how she waved to him through the open passenger window with that half grin she always gave when she thought he was fussing too much. She'd forgotten her water bottle, he'd noticed, but let it go, figuring the team would have extras. Now that tiny decision tormented him. What if she'd collapsed because she was dehydrated? What if he could have prevented all of this? That was the cruelty of guilt. It took the ordinary and twisted it into something monstrous. It wasn't the big mistakes that haunted you, it was the small ones, the ones you barely noticed at the time. And now, sitting here, Tom felt like every parenting decision he'd ever made was on trial. He thought about the nights he worked late to make ends meet, the times he asked Lily to be patient, to grow up just a little faster. He thought of the birthday when he couldn't afford the bicycle she wanted, settling instead for a second-hand one with a scratched frame and a wobbly tire. She'd smiled anyway. She always smiled. But did she ever resent him for having less? For being just one parent trying to do the work of two? His thoughts drifted further back, to the day Melanie died. He hadn't cried then. Not at the funeral. Not when they lowered her into the ground. Not even when he found her half-written grocery list on the kitchen counter weeks later. Instead, he had picked up the pieces and kept moving, because Lily had needed him. There wasn't room for his grief. He buried it like a time capsule, sealed shut under layers of duty and routine. But now, watching that same hollow fear spread through him, he realized it had never gone away. It had just been waiting. And with it came the question he hated most: what if he failed again? Not just as a husband, but now as a father. What if Lily didn't make it through this? The thought ripped through him like glass. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room before sitting again, his knees bouncing, fingers tapping against the seat, as if he could drum the worry out of himself. He looked around, hoping for some distraction, some small sign of life. But the only other person in the room was an elderly woman sitting quietly near the windows, her hands folded over a worn leather purse. She didn't seem to be watching him, but there was a calmness in her posture, a kind of practiced patience that felt strangely comforting. He didn't speak, not yet, but something in him softened just a bit. And as another hour dragged by without answers, the walls of Tom's isolation began, slowly, to crack. The quiet was nearly unbearable now. Tom had cycled through every possible emotion: fear, guilt, anger, helplessness, until all that was left was exhaustion. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the scuffed floor tiles like they might offer some divine message. That's when he heard Ita's soft voice, gentle and warm, but firm enough to be heard over the hum of hospital machinery and distant footsteps. "You look like you've been here a while." It wasn't invasive, just observational. Tom looked up and found the elderly woman who had been sitting by the window now seated just one chair away. He hadn't even noticed her move. She had kind eyes, pale green, crinkled at the edges but sharp with life. Her silver-gray hair was neatly pulled back, and her outfit, though simple, had a quiet elegance. She held out a tissue without another word, and Tom, surprised, accepted it. Only then did he realize his cheeks were damp. He hadn't even noticed the tears. "I'm Margaret," she said, as if offering her name made the moment a little less heavy. Tom managed a nod. "Tom, is it your daughter?" she asked, her voice low but not prying. He exhaled slowly, unsure whether speaking the truth would help or make it worse. "Yeah, Lily. She collapsed at practice. Coach said she wasn't responding. Don't know how bad it is." Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or offer the empty reassurances that people so often throw out like bandages too small to cover the wound. She just nodded, like she understood more than she let on. "I've sat in this room before," she said softly. "Different year, different reason, but the same kind of fear. My husband had a stroke. They took him through those same double doors." Tom glanced at her, surprised at the calm in her voice. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. She smiled just a bit. "That was a long time ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. This place, it changes you." Tom didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure he was ready to speak about pain to a stranger. But Margaret's presence was oddly grounding, like a warm blanket in the middle of a storm. She didn't need to talk. She didn't need him to explain. She simply existed beside him, making the room feel a little less hollow. And for the first time in hours, Tom felt like he might not be completely alone. Minutes passed without another word between them, but the silence wasn't as heavy now. Margaret remained beside him, content to sit in the quiet, her hands clasped neatly in her lap. Tom kept glancing at the doors, waiting for a doctor to walk through with any news. But when none came, his thoughts drifted back toward the woman at his side. "You said your husband had a stroke?" he asked, not because he was making conversation, but because it felt like the right thing to meet her openness with his own. She nodded slowly. "Martin, 38 years married. One morning he just didn't wake up like usual. He was still breathing, but I knew something was wrong. They worked on him there for 12 hours. He never came home. Her words hung between them, not heavy, but reverent. Tom wasn't sure how to respond. He didn't want to say something meaningless like, "I can't imagine," because the truth was she could. And it terrified him. "How did you do it?" he asked. "Get through it?" Margaret's lips curved in a faint, wistful smile. "I didn't, not all at once. Some days, I didn't at all. I just learned how to keep breathing until breathing didn't hurt so much. I kept the lights on. Paid the bills. I talked to him every night, even if only in my mind. And slowly, the ache softened. It never left, but it stopped defining me." Tom swallowed hard. He could see pieces of himself in her story, fragments of lonely nights, quiet dinners, laughter turned memories. The difference was, Margaret had lived through the aftermath and came out still standing. That gave him a strange kind of hope, even if he didn't know what to do with it yet. Margaret looked at him kindly. "You love your daughter deeply. I can see that in your eyes. That kind of love, that's what keeps you moving when the rest of the world wants to stop." Tom nodded, eyes glistening again. "She's all I've got." Margaret leaned just slightly toward him, her voice soft. "Then you're stronger than you think." And with that simple truth, two strangers, bound by grief, bound by love, bound by the kind of quiet understanding that doesn't need to be explained, sat side by side, no longer isolated islands in the storm. The hours stretched on. The waiting room lights never dimmed. Nurses rotated in shifts, the buzz of activity never quite reaching the quiet corner where Tom and Margaret remained. Occasionally, Margaret would stand to stretch or sip water from the vending machine's tiny plastic cup, but she always returned. Tom tried not to watch the clock, but he couldn't help it. Every minute without an update gnawed at him like sandpaper on skin. He called Lily's name in his mind over and over, remembered every scraped knee he'd kissed better, every late-night chat about school crushes, every silly inside joke that only the two of them understood. And in between those memories were the darker ones, the times he lost his temper after long shifts, the mornings he forgot to pack her favorite granola bars, the one Christmas when all he could afford was a sweater 2 sizes too big. Each moment was a stone in his gut now, pressing heavier as the night wore on. Margaret didn't ask questions. She didn't interrupt his silence. But when Tom's breathing grew unsteady, she placed her hand gently on top of his. He didn't pull away. In that small gesture was a lifeline, a reminder that grief didn't have to be faced alone. When a doctor finally appeared, walking with a clipboard and measured steps, Tom's heart leapt to his throat. But the man passed them without pause. Not Lily's doctor. Not yet. Tom exhaled, almost angrily, the kind of anger born from helplessness. "It feels like time stopped," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Margaret nodded. "It does that. When you're waiting for your world to change, every second feels like an hour." He looked at her. "Why are you still here?" She tilted her head, smiling gently. "Because someone should be. No one should go through this alone." It was such a simple answer, and yet, it cracked something open in Tom's chest that had been sealed tight for too long. He nodded, unable to speak. So they waited, side by side in the quiet hush of hospital limbo, as the night crawled forward. Outside, the city carried on, traffic lights changed, people laughed, lives moved. But in that small fluorescent-lit room, a father held his breath for his daughter, and a widow lent her strength without ever asking for anything in return. By the time midnight arrived, the waiting room had seen a quiet shuffle of faces, nurses hurrying between stations, an orderly pushing a gurney, a tired mother carrying a sleeping toddler, but through it all, Margaret remained. She sat beside Tom with quiet dignity, neither pressing for conversation nor retreating into her own world. Her calm presence was beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like grace. Eventually, when Tom felt the weight of silence begin to close in again, he turned to her and asked, "How did you do it? How did you sit here alone and not lose your mind?" Margaret gave a faint, knowing smile and took a breath before answering. "I wasn't calm back then. Not at first. When Martin was brought in, I was a wreck. I sobbed, I prayed, I begged anyone in a white coat to give me good news, but none came. And after a while, something inside me went still. I realized I could panic all I wanted, but it wouldn't change the outcome. So I made a decision I would be present. I would love him through it, even if he couldn't hear me. And when he passed, I stayed until the sun came up, just to make sure he didn't leave alone. Tom sat with that for a while. The image of her younger self holding on to a fading life with more love than fear. It was haunting and beautiful and far too close to what he was feeling now. He thought about Melanie's final day show. He'd sat by her bedside, holding her hand even after her grip weakened. He hadn't spoken much then. He'd been too afraid his voice would crack and she'd see how scared he was. But Margaret had done what he hadn't. She stayed, fully present, through the darkest hour of her life. I couldn't talk about it for years, she continued, her voice soft but steady. But over time, I learned that grief isn't meant to be hidden away. It's meant to be carried, shared, even. That's why I come back here sometimes. I sit in this room and just wait. You'd be surprised how many people need a little quiet company. Tom looked at her in awe. He had assumed she was waiting for someone too. But she had simply come because she knew what this place demanded of people. She came for the ones who didn't have anyone else. "You're a good person," he said quietly, the words catching in his throat. "I'm just someone who's had to learn how to keep living," Margaret replied. "You will too, no matter what happens." And just like that, her story didn't just comfort him, it anchored him. It reminded him that loss doesn't destroy everyone. Some learn how to carry it. And in doing so, they become lifelines for others who are still learning how. The clock on the wall ticked past 1 in the morning when a young doctor, barely out of residency by the looks of him, stepped into the waiting room and scanned the sparse crowd. His eyes landed on Tom. "Mr. Bennett?" Tom shot to his feet so fast his legs nearly gave out beneath him. "Yes," he breathed, heart hammering. The doctor approached with a calm, professional expression, steady but unreadable. "Your daughter, Lily, is stable for now. She suffered a vasovagal syncope fainting episode, likely triggered by dehydration and overheating. We're keeping her under observation because her heart rate dropped significantly, but she's awake. A little disoriented, but responsive." Tom swayed on his feet. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard the words right. She's okay? "She's not out of the woods yet. But yes, it looks positive." The doctor nodded. "She's asking for you." Emotion rushed forward in Tom like a wave crashing through a dam. Relief, gratitude, sheer exhaustion, he felt it all at once. He covered his mouth with one hand and tried to breathe, but tears came instead. He didn't care. He let them fall. Margaret stood silently, a steady hand on his back, her touch grounding him as he struggled to process the news. "Can I see her?" he asked. "In a few minutes," the doctor said. "They're getting her settled." Tom sat down heavily, still trembling. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to, the doctor, Margaret, or something higher than them both. Margaret didn't speak right away. She simply let him cry. When his breathing evened out again, she sat back down beside him and squeezed his hand. "She's strong," she said. Tom nodded, voice raw. "She gets that from her mom." Margaret smiled gently, and maybe a little from her dad too. At that moment, Tom didn't feel weak or broken anymore. He felt human. Vulnerable, yes, but alive. And in Margaret's calm presence, he recognized something rare, not just kindness, but a quiet kind of heroism. She had shown up for someone she didn't know. She had held the weight of his silence, his fear, his guilt, and asked for nothing in return. For the first time since Lily collapsed, Tom felt the weight begin to lift. Not all of it, but enough to breathe again. As the tension eased from Tom's body, so did his need to maintain the stoic, unshakable mask he so often wore around others. His posture softened, his hands stopped shaking, and the pain in his chest loosened just enough for something else to take its place, something like clarity. He looked at Margaret, this woman who had appeared out of nowhere and given him more strength than any advice or doctor ever could. She hadn't come with answers. She had come with presence. And that had made all the difference. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said. his voice hoarse. Margaret chuckled lightly, not in mockery but in understanding. You don't have to. Just promise me something. Tom straightened, ready for anything. When she's better, she said, take a walk with her. Hold her hand. Tell her what scared you tonight. And listen when she tells you what scared her. Don't let this moment pass by like it never happened. These are the kind of nights that can change a relationship, make it stronger if you let it. Tom nodded slowly, the words sinking deep. He had spent so long trying to be everything for Lily, provider, protector, planner, that he sometimes forgot she needed something simpler. His honesty, his fear, his love, unshielded. This night had broken something open in him, and maybe that was a good thing. Margaret stood and reached for her purse. I should get home. I've kept you company long enough. Tom felt a pang of resistance. Will you be okay getting back? She smiled. Oh, I'm tougher than I look. He stood too, not wanting to let her walk away without saying what needed to be said. You were here when I needed someone most. I won't forget that. Margaret looked at him kindly. We all have our storms, Tom. Sometimes we just need someone to hold the umbrella for a while. Then, after a pause, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn piece of notepaper with her name and phone number scribbled on it. If you ever need someone to talk to, or if Lily wants to hear about how her dad held it together better than he thinks he did, you know where to find me. Tom took the paper like it was something sacred, folded it gently, and tucked it into his wallet. As Margaret walked away, he didn't feel abandoned. He felt blessed. Because sometimes, the people who stay for just one night leave the biggest mark. And Margaret Lane had given him more than comfort, she had given him hope. Tom leaned back in the waiting room chair, still clutching the note Margaret had given him. His body felt heavy, not just from fatigue but from the emotional toll of the night. A nurse had come by to let him know it would be another half hour before he could see Lily. She was resting, and they were monitoring her closely. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and sat down again. For the first time in hours, he allowed his body to relax, if only slightly. His eyes fluttered shut before he realized it, and he drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. In his dream, he was walking through the park near their house, the one where Lily had learned to ride her bike. The sun was high, birds chirping in the trees, and laughter echoed all around. He saw Melanie sitting on a blanket in the grass, waving to him. She looked just like she had before the illness, radiant and warm. Lily ran to him, healthy and strong, arms flung wide. He caught her in a hug and didn't want to let go. The joy was overwhelming. Then the dream shifted. The sun dimmed. Melanie's face began to blur, the edges softening like a photograph left out in the rain. He reached for her, but she faded with every step. Lily was gone too. He was back in the hospital, wandering the halls, calling their names. Panic rose in his chest, the walls closing in until a familiar figure appeared. Margaret, standing at the end of the corridor, calm and steady. She didn't say anything. She just held out her hand. Tom took it, and everything settled. The panic, the grief, the endless questions, all of it softened in that moment. He woke with a start, heart racing, unsure if he had been asleep for minutes or hours. The fluorescent lights still buzzed above. The waiting room was mostly empty. But the dream lingered, as vivid as the cold vinyl beneath his fingers. It wasn't a vision, he knew that, but it felt like something more than just a dream. It felt like a reminder that love doesn't leave, not truly. That even in the most uncertain moments, someone, somewhere, would be there to guide him back to hope. Margaret had held his hand in a dream, the same way she had in waking life. And though she was gone now, her presence remained like a quiet song that stayed long after the last note. He rose to his feet, steadier now. Lily was waiting. The first light of dawn was beginning to creep through the hospital windows when Tom was finally allowed into Lily's room. The hallway felt surreal, like walking into a different world. The night had been so long, so thick with fear, that the early morning calm seemed too gentle to trust. But when the nurse opened the door, and Tom stepped inside, all of that melted away. Lily was propped up slightly on the bed, her skin still pale, eyes half-lidded with weariness, but she smiled the moment she saw him. That smile, weak but real, broke something open in his chest. "Hey, Dad," she whispered. Tom crossed the room in 2 steps and knelt by her bed, taking her hand in both of his. "Hey, baby, you scared me," he said, and the lump in his throat nearly choked the words. "Sorry," she murmured, her fingers curling around his. "I didn't mean to." He shook his head, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Doesn't matter. You're here. That's all that matters." The doctor came in not long after and gave a more thorough update. Lily would need rest and careful monitoring, but her prognosis was good. They had ruled out anything life-threatening, though more tests would be done just to be safe. Tom nodded through it all, trying to absorb every word, but his focus kept drifting back to Lily, her breathing, her heartbeat, the warmth of her hand in his. When the doctor finally left, Lily looked at him and said, "You didn't sleep, did you?" He smiled. "Got a little rest. Met someone, actually." She raised an eyebrow, and the expression was so typically her that it made him laugh for the first time all night. "Not like that," he said, chuckling. "Her name's Margaret. She was in the waiting room. She helped me get through the night." Lily's gaze softened. That was nice of her. Yeah, it was. They sat together in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need filling. Outside, the city was waking up. Traffic began to hum, the sky growing lighter by the minute. But in that room, time moved slower. It was a moment of stillness, of survival, of deep gratitude neither of them could fully name yet. Tom knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel impossible. They let Lily go home 2 days later. Her energy was low, but her spirit was high, and the doctors were confident she was on the mend. Tom made her favorite soup, let her fall asleep on the couch to old cartoons, and texted the school to explain everything. For once, he didn't worry about deadlines or groceries or the next paycheck. All that mattered was that she was okay. One quiet evening a few days later, while Lily was napping upstairs, Tom pulled out the note Margaret had given him. He'd read the number a dozen times, but tonight, he finally dialed. He didn't expect her to answer on the first ring, but she did. "Hello? Hi, it's Tom, from the hospital." There was a pause, then a warm laugh. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." They talked for a long time. About Lily, about life, about everything and nothing. Margaret told him more about Martin, about how he made her coffee every morning, how he never learned to fold laundry right but tried anyway. Tom told her about Melanie, about the way she danced in the kitchen while making pancakes, how she'd always insisted on family dinners even during the worst weeks of chemo. The memories didn't sting the way they used to. Not tonight. They felt alive, like they belonged to a story still being written. Before they hung up, Margaret said something that stayed with him long after the call ended. "You're not meant to carry everything alone, Tom. Let someone stand beside you, even if it's just for the walk forward." He stared at the phone, her words echoing in the quiet. He wasn't sure what was happening between them. It wasn't romantic, at least, not yet. But it was something more than comfort. It was a space being made in his heart again, a space that had once been too broken to imagine filling. Maybe healing didn't always arrive with fanfare. Maybe sometimes it came with a hand held in silence, a voice steady through the night, and a kindness so ordinary it became extraordinary. 2 weeks had passed since the night Tom thought his world might end. Lily had returned to school, still a bit tired, but laughing with her friends again and sleeping soundly at night. Her color had come back. So had her appetite. And each time Tom looked at her sitting on the porch after dinner, curled up with a book, or tossing a soccer ball gently in the backyard, he found himself pausing to breathe in the simple joy of her presence. Everything felt more vivid now. The ordinary had become precious. He hadn't seen Margaret since the hospital, but they'd spoken often. Their conversations were never rushed, never filled with expectations. She would share a story. He'd share one back. Sometimes they talked about grief, sometimes about gardening or music or recipes. But always there was comfort. Always there was ease. It felt like building something quietly, like stitching a quilt, one thread at a time. So when Margaret invited him and Lily over for tea one Saturday afternoon, Tom didn't hesitate. He mentioned it to Lily as casually as he could, unsure how she'd respond. But she simply smiled and said, "She sounded really nice. I'd like to meet her." The walk to Margaret's house wasn't far, just a few quiet blocks away. Her home was small but warm, with ivy curling along the porch railing and flower boxes that overflowed with color. She answered the door wearing a soft cardigan, her silver hair pulled back the same way it had been that night. But something in her eyes looked lighter now, like a woman who had also begun to find peace again. Margaret greeted Lily first, kneeling slightly to meet her at eye level. "You've got your father's eyes," she said kindly. "But your smile? That's all your own." Lily grinned, clearly charmed. Tom felt something settle in his chest, like watching two parts of his life gently come together. Inside, Margaret had set the table with mismatched china and homemade shortbread cookies. They talked easily, falling into rhythm like old friends. Lily listened to Margaret's stories with the curiosity only a teenager can have for someone who's lived a very different life. Margaret told her about her garden, her favorite books, and the time she accidentally joined a yoga class, thinking it was a lecture on meditation. Tom sat back, watching them with quiet gratitude. He didn't know what this would become, a friendship, something deeper, something somewhere in between. But what he did know was that this felt like a beginning, not an end. After tea, Lily wandered into the garden, running her fingers along the lavender bushes. Tom stayed behind, helping Margaret gather the plates. As she reached for the teapot, her hand brushed his, and neither of them moved away. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't sudden. Just a moment held between two people who had learned that healing doesn't happen all at once, but sometimes it starts with a single connection. Outside, Lily called for him to come see a butterfly resting on a rose. He smiled at Margaret and said, "Come with me." She nodded, and together they stepped out into the light. It was a new chapter, quiet, tentative, and full of promise, not written in grand gestures, but in kindness, in shared strength, in the decision to open the door to someone else. And sometimes, that's how the most beautiful stories begin.